I'm Peter from Canadian Jesuits International, and it's good to be here with you today. Noluthando, Honono, is our guest speaker for a campaign called Education, Her Right, Our Future. And so it's looking at the importance of education. And this is really important in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals that the international community has set for 2030 to reach. We're at the halfway point to that. It was agreed upon in 2015. We're at the halfway point to 2030, and we're not going to get there. We're not going to get there because COVID-19 put a big wrench in everything. And so we were trying to work on gender equity to reach 2030. But since COVID-19, things have gone backwards. And so girls' enrollment in school post-COVID-19 has dropped significantly. So Noluthando is going to be speaking about some of the barriers that girls in the Global South face, about some of the policy issues in terms of addressing that, and why this matters to us. COVID-19 has demonstrated that we live in an interconnected world. And so what happens in one part of the world is going to impact what happens in another part of the world. And evidence shows that when girls are educated, it lifts everyone up. And so it's really key to ensure that girls are receiving quality education. It's a rights-based approach. So education, her right, our future. So that's how we've framed it. And I'm going to turn things over to Noluthando for her presentation, and then we'll kind of manage the Q&A time together with her. Noluthando was supposed to be here in person. She was to have arrived in Toronto this past week, Wednesday. But when she arrived at the airport, she got news that her brother had been shot. And so the good news is that he survived the operation. He's on the road to recovery, and Noluthando is going to be joining us this coming Wednesday for the remainder of the speaking tour that we have, going to Ottawa, going to Toronto, and going to Guelph, to the other Jesuit parish that we have in Guelph. So I want to welcome Noluthando. She's been going through a lot, and she graciously agreed to come via Zoom to give her presentation to you folks today. So without any further ado, I want to welcome Noluthando.
Potential to be completely taken away at any point, and was something that I was fortunate enough to access because of the kind of family and matriarchs that existed within my own family structure, which led to me being able to access education. Unfortunately, I existed in a space where I was able to see the disparities between children who were able to access education and those that were not. And those disparities were something that created a significant discomfort in me. But beyond that, the work that I had to put in to be able to access tertiary education made it so that I became significantly more aware of the fact that there were so many things that made it difficult and so many barriers of entry for many young people in the global south in terms of being able to access said education. And some of the things that cause for us to not be able to access education, especially the girl children in particular, have had cultural significance, a cultural significance that has to some degree determined the extent to which we're able to live out the full potential of young girls within a lot of African countries in particular. And most of these are as a result of the very patriarchal nature of the societies that we exist within, and the understanding that girl children are groomed to become wives and to become mothers and take care of children, and therefore become family matriarchs. This history of culture that placed a significance on marrying off younger girls in order for them to be able to have children earlier and therefore grow the lineage of the families that they marry into has meant that a significant portion of children, of girl children in particular, aren't able to access education, especially in parts that are significantly more rural or parts that that exercise a significantly more conservative way of doing things in terms of their cultures within those spaces. What this has meant then is that the younger a girl is when they get married off, the higher the bride price for that girl. And this is largely due to a number of things. The first is the understanding that when they marry young, they're likely to have more children, which means that whoever marries said girl would have a greater chance of growing their lineage and keeping their name alive. And secondly, it would mean that they were considered pure because in that case they would be untouched and complete virgins. And this is something that is considered to be important in a lot of cultures. What this has meant then is that brides, young child brides, are a constant occurrence, something that we constantly have to be dealing with on an activism front, as well as trying to get governments to actively involve themselves in the protection of children, girl children in particular, from becoming child brides. This is something that South Africa has been significantly more successful in engaging with because of the way that the South African Constitution is worded, as well as the fact that South Africa has placed itself at the forefront of actively engaging cultural spaces in such a way that we're able to create a reasonable relationship between culture and the law, such that the law is able to effectively adjudicate issues of culture in particular instances where that is necessary. On a second level, because girl children aren't able, for the most part, to inherit things from their parents in most African countries, and this is because it is given to the oldest male child, which is a concept we refer to in law as male primogeniture. A lot of the time, there is no need to actively participate in investing in the education of girls because they cannot effectively grow their own families because they are to be married off. But secondly to that, it also then means that they aren't able to create any kind of generational wealth that they can then utilize to be able to access other opportunities as well. Teenage pregnancy is something that's also been significantly more problematic in a lot of the global south. And this is largely because of a lack of education in terms of what options exist for young people as it relates to things like sex education, things like the kind of rights that they have to their bodily autonomy, because a lot of young women who are getting pregnant at a very young age as minors are actually having to deal with having those pregnancies because they don't understand or don't know of things like contraceptive options. They don't have information about the fact that they're able to say no to the advances of the people who end up getting them pregnant to begin with, because they don't know the law around statutory rape and all other kinds of sexual assault that exist, specifically because the law is not written in a way that it's palatable for people who aren't educated, but makes it significantly more difficult for those people who are taken advantage of to be able to use the law to their advantage as well. As a result of COVID-19, there's also been quite a bit of a growth in making children, girl children, especially the firstborn children, to become family caretakers. And what that has meant is that should there be a passing in a family of a mother or a parental figure, the oldest girl child ends up being the parental figure of that home. And this we saw during the scourge of the HIV and AIDS pandemic, and has also taken quite a bit of a toll on girl children currently in the COVID-19 recovery process, because we haven't quite recovered from the COVID-19 pandemic and the amount of damage that was done during the time where COVID-19 was quite rampant and did quite a bit of it took quite a few lives in that process. What this has meant then is that a lot of young girls did not return to school post the lockdowns that took place during COVID-19. In South Africa, it started off as a 21-day lockdown that was announced at level 5, which meant that we weren't able to leave our homes for a 21-day period. That turned into a year and a half of different levels where we would slowly ease the restrictions that would allow people out. What that meant for education, though, was that only children who had access to technology or had access to schools that were able to give them access to that technology were able to continue with schooling, and others would be left to be 2 years behind. The problem with being 2 years behind the class you originally were meant to graduate or matriculate with is that many parents then no longer see value in sending their children back to school when they're significantly older, and believe it's better for them to then just seek out some kind of employment. That employment is usually menial labor, hard labor, and it usually is not very sustainable and lands up in a situation where many young girls end up either being married or finding alternative ways of being able to make money to live for themselves, which aren't always the best ones in terms of safety, which aren't always the best ones also in terms of the kind of options you would want to give to a girl child. As a result, then, this has meant that a lot of work has had to go into creating programs that would bring young girls back into a space of education. And in the extent where the government has failed, multiple non-profit organizations, non-government organizations have tried to do quite a bit of work to be able to create some kind of programs or different kinds of ways to create that access. This has been quite difficult, and this is specifically difficult in those spaces where infrastructural development has been significantly slow, and this is in our villages. This is in township spaces where not only is crime quite rampant, but we also just don't have the ability to make those resources available, specifically because the infrastructure doesn't already exist to work from, and people are working from whatever it is that they have. This could include easily having children being taught under a tree. It could also include things like just not being able to get them to a classroom because the value of having them in that classroom is something that their own parents don't find to be something that is valuable. Finally, then, in terms of the barriers that exist, there's quite a bit of a problem with political spaces within different countries in Africa having multiple conflicts at the same time. So you've got Somalia with quite a few issues. There's Cameroon with the Anglophone Francophone conflict. There are multiple countries that are currently dealing with massive conflicts that mean that people have to flee those countries into neighboring African countries. Many of them tend to go down to the south because the south tends to be significantly more liberal in the way in which it interacts with different things, including refugees. What this has meant then is that a number of people enter into these countries and it takes them a significant amount of time to be able to access refugee status or even asylum seeker status, which means that for a lot of time, they aren't able to access basic services like being able to take their children to school and ensure that they're able to get an education. Because in order to be able to register into a school, you must have documentation that allows the school to be able to let your child in, because each school must be able to account for each child that is in that school, each set of resources that goes to those children, but also just in general, in terms of safety, they need to be able to have the safety regulations met in terms of registering the child and making sure that they are on a class list and making sure that they are in a particular class that they are allotted to, so that if they're missing from that class, we're able to track them. In the instance where they don't have documentation, no one is able to do so, which means the education system is unable to place them into a school, which means a significant portion of children who are seeking out refugee and asylum seeker status along with their parents are not able to access education. And this obviously becomes significantly worse post-COVID because Home Affairs, all of the different parts of government that work with ensuring those kinds of registrations take place are significantly slower because they're backlogged from not having worked for quite a period of time during COVID-19. So I've told you all of this about why there are barriers to entry, but what is most important in this conversation is why this matters to everyone, including those it does not directly impact. In a more globalized world where we've begun to participate in different ways of communication with one another through social media, even through video conferencing, the way that I'm currently speaking to you, it's become significantly more clear that in order for any part of the world to truly thrive, we need to be able to create the kind of environment that allows for that to happen. And most importantly, collaboration is what ultimately leads us to those kinds of environments, because it is what exists in one part of the world that ultimately functions as a way to assist the rest of the world in getting closer to those kinds of developments and growths. As a result, when thinking about education, we think about education as being something that is a constant process of development, something we can continue to build upon to make better in all parts of the world. We often look outside of the systems that we exist within to find inspiration on things that we can use to make better. So South Africa currently has undergone in the last 4 years 3 curriculum changes in our public school sector to ensure that we are constantly able to at least compete on a global level. However, when it comes to access, that is not something that we've been able to effectively push in a way that is going to bring us to that same competitive level. And so when young South Africans matriculate, get their A levels, if they end up doing A levels, and leave to go to the UK, leave to go to the US, leave to go to Canada, they leave behind a massive gap within the African continent, where we aren't able to use those same brilliant minds in a way that is going to allow for greater development, more sustainable development within these particular nations as well. It then becomes significantly more important for us to focus on creating access to education so that when that brain drain does happen, you have a significant portion of young people who remain and are able to effectively ensure the sustainability and continued development of these global South countries. Because without that development, it then means that the only way we're able to create a more sustainable existence for the global south is through maintaining rudimentary mechanisms of maintaining our economies or even just maintaining our schools of thought. And that becomes significantly more dangerous. One, because they're not sustainable. And secondly, because the more rudimentary they are, the more primitive they tend to be as well in terms of the way in which we interpret specific things, which is why currently we find ourselves dealing with things like FGM. We currently find ourselves dealing with issues of excessive and rampant patriarchy that places young girls in a position where they aren't able to access an education. It then becomes significantly important to create these programs. But most importantly, it becomes important to engage with policymakers and create an open line of communication as it relates to education in particular. For example, in South Africa, the way our constitution is written, especially when it comes to socioeconomic rights, we are allowed right of access to those socioeconomic rights. So, for example, when it comes to education, it is written as everyone has the right of access to education. What this means is you don't have the right to an education, which means you cannot walk into any school and be educated, but you have the right to access that education based on whatever requirements a school has in order for you to enter the gates of said school. In the instance where you are close to only private schools and not government schools, and those are excessively expensive to the point where most people can't afford them, you cannot enter that school if you cannot meet the financial requirements of said school, which means you are at the mercy of whatever the government expects, is able to give at that point in time. The problem with this is that in most instances, because of a lack of infrastructural development, because of a lack of development in some spaces, inclusive of villages, townships, etc., there aren't enough schools to go around. And when there are enough schools, there aren't enough teachers within those schools for the amount of children that end up going to those schools, which means that the quality is significantly less comparative to, and where there are no schools, it means that those children don't get to go to school because it is within the discretion of what is available for the government at that point in time. And so the kind of pushes that need to be made or that are currently being made are those that seek to make policy significantly more narrowed towards creating that access, so that when we look at our constitution and speak about that access, we're able to speak about it in tangible terms that specifically seek to engage the fact that young people need to be given that access in order for that access to exist, especially when we're thinking about the economic disparities that exist between people in a lot of these African countries. Taking South Africa into consideration, we have one of the biggest gaps between the rich and the poor. And so that means that a significant portion of the South African population is very likely relying on that little bit of access that would come from the state. And so if that access is not given at a large enough scale, a big portion of the South African populace becomes uneducated. And even when they do get educated at a primary and secondary level, more often than not, they are unable to access tertiary education, which has been a massive conversation in South Africa over the last few years. We've seen hashtag fees must fall, which was a bunch of protests which started in late 2015 and moved and have been sort of continuous every year, if we're being honest, because we haven't been able to find a sustainable funding model that would allow young people to be able to access tertiary education to this point, which then means the fight, the activism, the push towards getting government to make education, primary, secondary, and tertiary, more accessible to young Africans is something that continues and continues to become the fore of the conversations that are being had by those of us who've had the privilege of accessing education and wish to have that privilege extended to any and all children within the global south, so that they can be able to access opportunity, so that they can be able to create and build using that very opportunity to access education. Because education ultimately is a foundation that is very much required in our current world and continues to be something that is at the fore of everyone being able to access some degree of success. And so as a result, without education, it becomes significantly more difficult for young people to be able to create any kind of agency for themselves. And this is why it's so incredibly important for all of us to be involved in some way or another in creating the kind of advocacy that pushes for education and also creates a world where people can get the kind of access that is needed for that education to play out. And all of these barriers to entry are something that, should the rest of the world and all African nations really just come together to figure it out, we would most likely be able to create more sustainable mechanisms of creating access to education. That is that from me. And Peter, I'm guessing this is the good time to start opening for questions.
Absolutely. Thank you, Noluthando. Good. So I'm going to take the mic here. All right. Do we have any questions from the floor for Noluthando?
Hi there. I'm assuming you can hear me. Thank you so much for sharing your experience and your lived experience and your knowledge of your community and what the needs are. I have a question specifically about post-COVID recovery. What do you think is the most significant need for our young girls at this time in terms of their education, their growth, their development?
Okay, it's quite a difficult question to answer, and I think the reason it's so incredibly difficult is because it's very contextual, especially in the African sense, and in a lot of the global South. I think there are three major things that are at the fore for me at the moment. The first is, and this is the hardest one, I think, to achieve, is creating an understanding of the importance of a formal education. And that creating that understanding not only to the young people themselves, because many of them actually want to be educated, but creating that understanding to the people who make decisions about their lives, their parents, the grandparents, those who have now seen that these kids can exist outside of an education system and find that that existence is sufficient. I think it becomes very important for us to kind of create that shift in mindset of parents who believe that once a child is 16 years old, they're ready for marriage and can now be sent off to have children, as opposed to growing and developing their own dreams and being able to access a platform with which to make those dreams come true. I think that's the first one, and that's the most difficult one. It's that change in mindset that sort of pushes parents to want to encourage their children to gain an education and become independent. Secondly, I think is it's a resource issue. It's an issue of making sure that parents don't have to make the decision between buying a school blazer and buying maize meal and vegetables for their children to eat. The difficulty with being able to make the decision between buying something that is important for a child to go to school versus feeding your entire family is one that a lot of parents have to deal with, and quite regularly so, which is even greater when we're talking about girl children in particular, because there's also that stage where where nature takes its course and development means that you're now going into a menstrual cycle. And so a lot of girls end up not going to school during that time because having to select class, and to select between feeding your other children and buying sanitary pads for another one so that they may be able to go to school is something that's not relatively easy for them to do. And then thirdly, it's training more teachers and making sure that those teachers are assigned to schools so that you don't have a situation where you have 60 children in a classroom and one teacher. Not only are they tired, really, not only are these teachers absolutely exhausted, it's very, very difficult for them to be able to give the kind of attention that is needed for those children to be able to make the best of the education that they have. Not to mention instances where there are special needs that need to be met in order for a child to have a good learning environment. Those two are things that we need to think about. So it is quite a layered question. There are quite a number of complexes that come into play with regards to that question. I hope I've answered it to some degree, though.
Question wishes to express their gratitude for your answer. Another question.
What gives her hope? This is more than a distressing fear. The layers of complexity that would even begin to be addressed before young girls could ever be educated. What gives you hope in all of this, that there is going to be movement?
Okay, so what gives me hope, I think, is seeing progress. There has been progress, and the progress can be tracked rather from a time where we didn't have girls attending school, where that wasn't even something that was part of the conversation. And now being able to have a conversation about making sure more girls are able to enter the school system and stay within it. I think one of the greatest things that social media, access to content from other spaces has done for us is that it's shown that there's progress in the world and people are moving towards a direction where they're paying attention to the needs of their children, girls, boys, and the like. And so that has to some degree also informed some of the decisions that some parents have made over time. I think there's been also a move towards looking at your neighbor and seeing what the neighbor is doing. And so some people have had their children graduate and have shown pride in having those children become graduates, the first graduates in their families, the first graduates in their communities, the first graduates wherever they are. And that has done quite a bit in being able to inspire some to do the necessary work to make sure that their children are also being put through school and to some degree are accessing an education. So I think that the positive impact of influence that we have on one another has done a significantly great job of creating that kind of forward mobility. And my hope is really that we capitalize on that forward mobility and get more people to be inspired to push and do exactly that. Because that's, I think, one of the few ways we're able to create small but incremental changes within the spaces of education.
Great. Thank you for that answer. Other questions? Yep.
At your level and at an international level, how did you actually, I see you with the Jesuit International, how did that hook up and how could that be more effective for much more education here?
So just to clarify your question, the connection with Canadian Jesuits International and
So I
Nolan.
think it's
Yeah.
quite important to say that number one, there are probably significantly more impactful ways of doing advocacy and stuff locally as well, in spaces that you exist within, in small bits that will be able to get some kind of changes here and there. In terms of the Jesuit space and my existence within it, quite simply, I was a very curious and very eager child. And so we had a Jesuit priest in our parish, and I was constantly picking that poor man's brain and trying to get the answers to all of my worldly questions from him. And so as a result, I began slowly doing different bits of work here and there for different things. I've been involved in refugee discussions. I've been involved in different conversations, but my main concern has always been education. It's always been something that I've cared specifically about because of some of my own personal difficulties that I've dealt with as it relates to being able to access education the way I wanted to access education. And so that is how the sort of engagement between myself and the Jesuit community began. It was really out of curiosity, which then sort of began to add on, where I was able to take advantage of a lot of opportunities that I could use to utilize my own skill sets to assist, but also develop those skill sets within the community while working on different projects and different things. Outside of that, though, I've been doing quite a bit of work in preparation of multiple programs to try and sort of bridge the gap in education between private and public school kids, and really understanding the differences either in curriculum and approach, and how we can best create a space that makes for quality education in public schools and quality education in spaces where you don't have an orthodox schooling system, but can create some kind of access to education for children.
Great. Thank you, Noluthando. Other question from the floor? Yeah.
Thank you, Noluthando. I really appreciate your presentation. This has to do with, I know that probably you're kind of moving towards government-sponsored schools. I just wonder if you could speak to the importance of perhaps having single-sex schools for girls. Do you see a real value of that, or do you see are you ambivalent on that, or is it going to be government policy? It's going to be both sexes.
Okay, so I'm currently working in a all boys school, strangely enough, and I find that my current focus is probably less whether or not the schools are same-sex or co-ed, but more that more kids get into a schooling space. I do, however, think that there are major advantages to single-sex schools from what I've been able to witness in the school that I'm currently working in. But I think where it does to some degree fall short is on the social end of things and the understanding of some of like the differences and difficulties that are faced by the different genders when you aren't within a space where you're able to encounter them on a regular basis. It does tend to make for issues in terms of sensitivity in that regard. But for me, I think I'm not particularly attached to whether or not schooling is co-ed or single sex, because I think the biggest issue at the moment is creating access and then creating success within that access.
I'd like to go back to your the question of hope and progress, particularly in South Africa, which seems a more progressive country. So, at the political level, are you seeing any movement or shift at a political level in terms of the need for more girls to be educated, and even in society in general, are you seeing more women in positions of influence and power?
For South Africa in particular, yes. I think South Africa has done a relatively good job of really bringing to the fore the politics of gender and really understanding, or trying at the very least to seem like we're understanding the value of educating the girl child and bringing them to a space of influence. I think on a political level, there's been quite a bit of discussion at the moment about the way that our parliament is comprised of more men than women, and how we can be able to shift that dynamic. There's been an age conversation as it relates to things like parliament. There's also been quite a bit of conversation around leadership and women in leadership. Just recently, actually not that recent, I think it was about four years ago, the ANC, which is our leading political party at the moment, had their presidential campaigns taking place, and Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, who is a woman, was running and contesting the presidential seat, which would have then made her president of the nation. She lost that vote by a very, very small margin. And that's how we ended up with our current president, Cyril Ramaphosa, as being the president of the country. So there's been quite a bit of movement in terms of creating space for women, and also just like understanding the value of the women within leadership on a political level as well. The Democratic Alliance, which is currently the leading opposition for some time, was led by a woman, Helen Zille. And there were quite a number of women who were integral to that time where she was available, where she was the leader of the Democratic Alliance. And since then, there have been multiple women involved in that. I do think, however, that there is space to do a bit more. I think there's space to place women in because I think what we've done now is we've gotten comfortable with a woman being the deputy secretary of something. We're comfortable with a woman being the deputy to a man in a particular role. We're comfortable with women having the secondary leadership roles as opposed to the main ones. I think there's a lot of shift, however, in business. And that's where I'm seeing the biggest shift is in business, where a lot more women are taking on frontline roles in terms of leadership in that space. So there's definitely been quite a bit of movement on the South African end.
Hello, this is Joanne. I'm just wondering, we have a system here of adult learning and literacy centers for those folks who perhaps didn't have access to learning as younger people. I'm just wondering if those same systems might exist there.
Yes, they do. We do have adult learning systems in South Africa. There are probably a number of issues in terms of the number of such centers that we have, and the extent to which they have the capacity to be able to register the many people who would need to have access to that education. Secondly, there's also probably an issue of how many people are taking advantage of that access, specifically because, I mean, a lot of people probably feel like once you've been at a job for the last 25 years, maybe that's all there is to it. Maybe that's all there is to life. Just stay in that job, make sure you keep your family sustained, and that's about it. And so that does tend to happen as well, that people don't take advantage of the existence of that opportunity specifically because it means getting out of their comfort zone, but they do exist.
Noluthando, this is a question from me, Peter. In terms of a Canadian audience, what do you think would be most valuable in terms of what actions can we take here in Canada towards addressing this issue around barriers that girls face in the global south in obtaining and fulfilling their right to an education?
Oof, it's a loaded question, and I'm going to try my very best to respond to it. A couple of things from me, right? The first is that I think that there has to be an acknowledgement that there's more to the global south than, say, South Africa. There's a tendency to pay attention to the strides that are made in South Africa and attribute them to the rest of the global south, which means that we become significantly more oblivious to the problems that exist elsewhere. But beyond that, there's also this tendency to like gloss over some of the issues that South Africa has because Cape Town and Johannesburg look so great and have everyone thinking that we are Joburg and Cape Town, which is not actually true if you look at some of the issues that exist in South Africa in relation to education. So the first thing I think is becoming more intentional in accessing knowledge around the problems that exist as it relates to access to education. Research needs to be done, and it needs to be done thoroughly so that all conclusions made are made from a position of knowledge. But secondly, I think that there's a greater access to policymakers that probably exists in the north than what does here. There's quite a lot of red tape in South Africa to just gaining access to a mayor, to just gaining access to the most low level of politicians is very, very difficult because of red tape. And I think that when there is a bit of pressure from other governments, especially significantly more powerful governments that are considered to be significantly more powerful, there tends to be a movement in terms of creating policy or even creating programs that support already existing policy at a faster pace or at a pace that makes more sense on the South African end. So I do think that participating in engaging governments, even the Canadian government, to actively seek out partnerships around issues of education, even considering non-governmental organizations and their participation in global South issues is something that would be absolutely incredible to participate in. But on an individual and sort of lower level, because I think that government related things tend to be unnecessarily bureaucratic, I think participating in programs within our own schools, within your own schools, where you see the extent to which the schools can share resources. And by resources, I mean every now and then creating partnerships with schools that are outside of Canada in Africa, and sharing resources in terms of teachers, teaching material, sharing resources in terms of exchange programs, creating that bridge between the countries, such that even if it's one that starts off really small, the extension of those kinds of programs can be something that trickles across all of Canada, and maybe even trickles across all of whatever specific country that partnership is going to be with. Because I think those small acts where we actively engage in those sharing of resources, sharing of knowledge, sharing of even expertise is something that ultimately leads to us being able to create even better partnerships. But lastly and most importantly, I think that there's like a lot of bureaucracy in terms of just gaining access to countries, right? For example, my visa to come to Canada was such a nightmare to try and get. And just that alone makes it significantly more difficult to even be able to create those kinds of relationships. And so I think that too is an element that may need to be engaged in terms of how do we make the possibility of sharing things, the possibility of sharing resources, the possibility of even being able to create exchange programs, something that's significantly easier to access, especially when thinking about the bureaucratic nature of government and how much that plays into us not being able to take advantage of the resources that currently exist all over the world.
Just to give the audience a sense of what that nightmare was, we had applied for Noluthando's visa in the end of May of 2023. Biometrics were submitted in June. She was told that it would take 30 business days, between 10 to 30 business days, to receive her visa. And we didn't get word of her visa until mid-November, which was already past the speaking tour that we had originally wanted to do with her in the fall. So we had to move everything to this time of year. And we had to ask to an extension or a change in the visa that she had in order to accommodate the timing difference because of their delay and not fulfilling what they had said would be the case, right? So that's the other thing that I just want to flag is that this coming Tuesday, I mean the federal budget has been slowly released over the last couple of weeks, and this coming Tuesday is going to be like the kind of the big final announcement of the federal budget. And so I would encourage us to take a look at what gets announced in terms of international aid development, and particularly tying it into the Trudeau government feminist agenda, so ensuring that one, spending for international aid needs to go up to meet international obligations that we entered into and we had agreed to, and that it's tied to programs specifically for girls' education. So I would encourage you to listen to what is announced. This is the portfolio of Ahmed Hussein, who is Canada's International Development Minister. and it connects also partly with the ministry of that Marcy Ian for youth and gender as well. So it's part of her ministry department too. So I would encourage you to take a look at that this coming week, and then write a letter to your member of parliament if you don't see the increase that should be there, and we will send you some information in terms of what we're asking for in terms of the Government of Canada to increase funding for, so that we can meet the obligation of the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, which we had agreed to in 2015 as part of the global community. So just to flag that for your attention as well. Good. We're just after 1. It's a beautiful sunny after 2. Sorry. Yes, the clock here is wrong. So it's just after 2 on a beautiful sunny afternoon. So I thank you so very much for coming out here. But I did want to give one more opportunity. If there was someone that still had a burning question that you wanted to ask, I want to give that opportunity. If not, we can bring our afternoon to a close. But yes, you have a question? Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm not very quick on thinking automatically, but this certainly sheds a light on the horrible burdens of gender just being discriminated against and all the discriminations that exist. And I thank you, and I'll pray for you that you remain strong.
Thank you. Absolutely. Did you hear that, Noluthando?
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you very, very much. I think we take for granted just how much everyone deals with on a regular basis until someone says, oh, but that's a lot. And then it kind of pops back into your head that there's a lot going on. So thank you very much. That is much appreciated, and it will definitely assist in continuing the cause.
Great. Thank you very much, Noluthando. I look forward to seeing you on Wednesday. And just a reminder that Jenny, our executive director, will be picking you up from the airport, and I will see you Wednesday later afternoon. I will pop by where you're staying and connect with you there. Look forward to seeing you. So you're welcome to leave the Zoom meeting, Noluthando. Thanks very much for your contribution this afternoon. On behalf of everyone here, yeah, they are applauding. So thank you very much, and we will see you later, Noluthando. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you also for signing in. If you are on our mailing list already, that's great, but it just allows us to keep our records up to date in terms of who from St. Ignatius attended these workshops. So it gives us a picture over time how people engage with us through this Jesuit parish as well. So thank you for signing in. Our publications are on the back there. And just to orientate you to these 2 publications are specifically on the topic of girls' education. So written by contributors from the Global South. You will find them quite interesting, enlightening. These 2, this relates to when I brought Father Jacques Nzumbu from last year here, speaking about the issue of mining cobalt and how that relates to the green energy transition. There is an intersecting connection with girls' education as well. So Dr. Evelyn Mayana, she is a professor at the University of or at Carleton University. And she did a presentation, and you can find it on our website, which speaks about the intersection of girls' education and mining, and how issues of poverty force girls into working for the mining industry, exploitative wages, at risk to sexual exploitation as well. And so you can take a listen to her presentation on our website as well. It's called Cobalt Blues, and it's together with Father Toussaint, who is the head of the Pedro Arupe Center in Lubumbashi in eastern Congo. So he also was part of that presentation, and that will give you a little bit more context as well. There's also some information about an advocacy symposium that we are hosting with young people. So there's a group of students from St. Paul's High School that are coming out to Ottawa for this event, from Loyola, from Montreal, from Campion College in Regina, a whole segment coming from Catholic schools from Ottawa, and then from Hamilton as well. And we're all gathering in Ottawa next week, with Noluthando being the keynote speaker, and trying to set up meetings with members of parliament around how Canada can act positively in terms of increasing the budgetary amount for international development. Because if we want a world that is prosperous and secure in the future, girls' education is one of the pillars of one of the foundational pillars for that global vision. If girls are not being educated, it is going to be significantly harder to obtain that goal, if not impossible. There's also evidence that shows that girls' education is intricately connected to addressing the climate issue. So when girls are educated, they are able to address and or to significantly lower implications of the climate crisis by developing different ways of cooking, by developing more conscientious household management. And so there is a study done from McGill University which lays this all out. If you just do a Google search of girls' education and the climate crisis, you will come up upon these resources as well. So I just want to flag that it's even that much more critical that we address this issue in terms of how it influences and impacts us in the global north as well. So thank you very much for your time today. I'm really grateful, and don't hesitate to take these with you. If there's a question that you might have of me before you go, yes?
The presentation today by Nolan.
Yeah.
Is that going to be on your website?
So it will be live streamed here on St. Ignatius website. If you go to their website, you'll find it. Yeah, but we will have Noluthando's presentation. We are doing a hybrid event in Toronto, and so when that's recorded, that will be on our website. Okay? Good. Thank you very much, everybody. Yeah, all right.